Hello learners, in today's session we are going to discuss about tertiary sources of information. In our earlier sessions we have seen categorization of information sources as well as about primary and secondary sources of information. In today's session we will concentrate on tertiary sources of information. As you know, primary sources of information are the first in the publication cycle. Secondary sources of information, they are in the second category or at the second number in the publication cycle. Tertiary sources of information, they are at the third place in the publication cycle. So, today we are going to discuss about tertiary sources of information. After this session, you will be able to define and identify different type of tertiary sources of information, state the characteristics of tertiary information sources and distinguish between primary, secondary and tertiary sources of information, because you have already seen the videos on primary and secondary sources of information, and today we are discussing about tertiary sources of information. So, primary, secondary and tertiary, these are the three different categories or classifications used to categorize different type of sources. By understanding these sources, we can understand if the author is providing information first hand, means the author is providing the primary kind of information, or if the information is coming from the fact, that is secondary or tertiary kind of information. So, the classification is dependent on the originality of the material and the proximity of the sources of the origin, means whether the sources are primary, secondary or tertiary in nature, it depends upon the content of these sources. A tertiary source generally consolidates and organizes primary and secondary sources together into one source in order to facilitate quick access to information. That is why they are known as the key to primary and secondary sources of information. Tertiary sources provide overviews of topics by synthesizing information gathered from other resources. Tertiary sources often provide data in a convenient form, means the form in which it is usable by the readers or the users of the information, and they also provide the information according to some specific context in which the readers need this type of information. In simple terms, tertiary sources distill primary and secondary sources into format that is accessible to a journal audience. Tertiary sources, they are very helpful in the beginning stages of research, means when the researcher is going to begin his or her research, these tertiary sources are very much useful to the researcher. Why these are useful in the beginning of the research? They give you a get and feel of the topic, means you will be able to identify or to reach to your topic with the help of these tertiary sources of information. They establish background information, they determine the current outlook and identify keywords and or special terminology associated with the topic. However, one should not rely heavily or entirely on tertiary sources of information, because they are just guiding you, they are just providing you information consolidated and synthesized from primary and secondary sources of information. They are not containing that type of information itself which is required for the research purposes. Tertiary sources are based on primary and secondary sources of information. as I already told you, and they serve as key to the primary and secondary sources of information. These are generally the compilation from primary and secondary sources, and they help the researcher or the searcher of information to select required information from primary and secondary sources. These publications do not carry subject information, but guide the users to the sources where information on that subject will be available. Means they do not contain information in them. What they contain? They contain the information about the sources where a searcher or a researcher will be able to find his or her desired information. So, tertiary sources are synthesis of primary and secondary sources. The sources, the person who compile these sources, they summarize the information, they compile the information, or they paraphrase the information from the primary or secondary sources of information. These sources sometimes even do not list the names of the authors who have created this information. Often you use a tertiary source to find both primary and secondary sources. Sometimes it may be difficult to categorize something strictly as tertiary source of information, and it may depend on how you decide to use the item in your research and writings. For example, like a textbook. If you remember the categorization which we have already discussed in our earlier session, some thinkers, they categorize textbook into secondary sources and some thinkers in tertiary sources. Why? Because it depends upon the contents. If it is entirely based upon the primary sources, then it is secondary source of information, that particular textbook, and if it is compiled from secondary sources of information, then that textbook will be placed under tertiary source of information. So, as said, it is very difficult sometimes to categorize a particular source particularly under secondary or tertiary sources of information. Then comes the question, why we need these tertiary sources of information? Because primary and secondary sources are already available. Why a third category is required in this categorization? An easy access to all primary sources is difficult for an individual researcher or a single library. To locate the information from primary sources, a number of secondary sources are published. These secondary sources act as a key to primary sources, but the number of primary and secondary sources is so large that it becomes difficult to locate even primary and secondary sources. So, there are tertiary sources to cite both primary and secondary sources of information. The main function of tertiary sources of information is to help the researchers in the use of primary and secondary sources of information. Tertiary sources are keys to primary and secondary sources. They provide information related to primary and secondary sources. That is why they are the key to primary and secondary sources of information. Due to growth of literature in various languages, countries, forms, areas, etc., the identification, selection and acquisition of primary, secondary and tertiary sources are becoming increasingly important. So, due to increase in literature at a very quick pace, identification and location of the required document is very difficult. Tertiary sources are designed as a bibliographic control device to assist in selecting the primary and secondary sources. Why bibliographic control device? Because they are providing the indexes, list or abstracts of the primary and secondary sources of information. That is why they are acting as the bibliographic control tool of primary and secondary information. Tertiary sources also helps to promote the use of primary and secondary sources, as they are containing the information about these sources, means they are telling the users about the availability of primary and secondary source of information. They describe and comment upon the various type of publications also. Even tertiary sources record the bibliographic information, which is important for better utilization of primary and secondary sources of information. Now coming to the characteristics of tertiary sources of information. Why we are calling them as tertiary sources of information? The first and the foremost characteristic is that they contains the information distilled, compiled and collected from primary and secondary sources of information. The main function is to aid the user in using primary and secondary sources of information. They work as a key to primary and secondary sources of information, and they are actually based entirely upon secondary sources of information. A published or unpublished work that is based on secondary sources of information is to be categorized under tertiary sources of information. Tertiary sources are not usually credited to one author, means they are compilation. So, generally we are not having one author for these type of sources. The information is not analyzed or interpreted as in the case of primary sources of information. Tertiary sources are generally not acceptable for academic research because they are just the guides, they are just the bibliographical control tools towards primary and secondary information. So, researchers are getting their desired information from the primary and secondary sources, and tertiary sources are working as the tools or the key to reach towards primary and secondary sources of information. Some examples of tertiary sources of informations are union catalogs, bibliography of bibliographies, guide to literature, guide to reference material, directory of directories, etc. Now, let us discuss some of the disadvantages and advantages of these tertiary sources of information. As far as advantages are concerned, as I just told you, they offer a quick and easy introduction to your topic. They may point to high quality primary and secondary sources of information, means they lead you, they take you to the concerned primary and secondary sources of information which you require for your research. The main disadvantage of these tertiary sources of information is that because of their distance, they may oversimplify or otherwise distort a topic. By rehashing secondary sources, they may miss new insights in a topic, means they are just providing the data collected basically from secondary sources of information. So, if a researcher tries to take something from tertiary sources of information, that information is not that much good for his or her research work. Then comes the types of tertiary sources of information. Now, we will discuss about the different types of tertiary sources. As we have already discussed, tertiary sources are those which are used to organize and locate secondary and primary sources. Under this category comes indexes, abstracts and databases. Indexes, they provide citations that fully identify a work with information such as author, title of a book, article and or journal publisher, publication date, volume and issue number and page numbers. Abstract contains the summaries of the primary and secondary sources of information. Databases also comes under this category, and these are sometime online also, and these online databases, they indexes that usually include abstract for each primary or secondary resource and may also include a digital copy of the resource. So, now we will see one by one all these types of tertiary sources of information. Under this category, the first type is library catalog. We all are familiar with library catalog. A library catalog is like a bibliography, but it is different from a bibliography. How it is different from a bibliography? Because bibliography is simply a list of available books, but a library catalog is also a list of books, but it is available in a particular library. Secondary and tertiary sources reflecting the collection of a particular group or a group of libraries is known as a union catalog. So, both type of catalogs, library catalogs and union catalogs comes under the category of tertiary sources of information. Now, coming to the union catalogs. What we mean by union catalogs? As I told you, these catalogs are catalogs of group of libraries. A list of the combined holdings of several libraries. A union catalog is a combined library catalog describing the collections of a number of libraries. Print union catalogs are typically arranged by title, author or subject. Electronic versions support keyword and Boolean searches. Union catalogs are useful to both librarians to assist the user in locating their requested materials and for sending the request for interlibrary loans, and for users also for asking about the interlibrary loan service. Some famous examples of union catalogs are WorldCat. Then the largest print union catalog ever published is the American National Union Catalog that is completed in 1981. Then comes the Union Catalog of Social Sciences periodicals published by ICSSR. Then INTCAT is also there. This is the Union Catalog of Indian Universities. It is a online catalog which is compiled by InflipNet. Then National Union Catalog of Social Science Serials, National Union Catalog of Science Serials in India, that is NUCSI. It is by NISCARE. Then the second type in this category is guide to literature. A guide to literature helps a researcher, reader and the like to find primary, secondary and tertiary sources of literature on a specific subject. These guides are in the form of books and are available for many fields. It should be noted here that these are not the guides which are used by the tourists, they are the travel guides. These are the literature guides which are related to a specific subject like social sciences, then any science subject like biology, chemistry, physics, etc. Then under this category of types of tertiary sources of information comes bibliography of bibliographies. As we discussed, bibliography is simply a list, and if we are compiling a list of these bibliographies, it becomes a bibliography of bibliographies. So, this list of bibliographies which direct readers to useful bibliographies through subject, name of an individual, place, institution, etc. is known as bibliography of bibliographies. They provide information about bibliographical aids. A bibliography of bibliography is a simple list of bibliographies. They may be classified or arranged alphabetically, subject wise, or any other arrangement should be there. Most of them are in book form. However, there are some which are issued periodically, also means after a fixed frequency, monthly, say quarterly or annually. Any frequency should be fixed for them. Then comes directory of directories. A directory of directories lists the directories available on a particular topic or pertaining to a particular area. For example, Guide to American and Scientific Technical Directories. As bibliography of bibliographies lists the bibliography, similarly directory of directories lists the directories, means if a directory is available on a particular subject, then this directory is going to list all those available directories on the particular subject. Then comes guides to reference sources. These guides are also very useful to know about the available reference sources. As we know, various type of reference sources are there, like encyclopedias, dictionaries, almanacs, yearbooks. So, wide range of reference sources are available, and it becomes very difficult for the libraries as well as the users to know about all these available reference sources. So, a list is required, a bibliographical control is required to know about these reference sources available. For this purpose, these guides to reference sources are the important tools. These guides of reference sources, they list all the reference books available, irrespective of their types, usually subject wise. A very good example of this type of guide to reference sources is Welford's Guide to Reference Material. Its 8th edition is available and it is published from London by Library Association, and this Welford Guide to Reference Material is presently available in 3 volumes. So, these guides help the libraries to search for the available reference sources, because libraries has to acquire different type of reference sources and they want information, a bibliographical tool to know about the published reference sources. So, these guides to reference sources work as bibliographical tool to select and acquire reference collection for the libraries. So, today we have discussed about tertiary sources of information. These tertiary sources of information, they synthesize information from primary and secondary sources of information. Tertiary sources, as we have discussed in today's session, can be lists, catalogs, guides, and in some cases textbooks also, if these textbooks are compiled from the secondary sources of information. So, this way these tertiary sources of information contains distilled information from the primary sources and mostly from the secondary sources of information. As I have mentioned in the beginning of this session, tertiary sources are third in the order of appearance, and these sources are based on primary as well as secondary sources and serve as guide to primary as well as secondary sources of information. Context determines whether a source is primary, secondary or tertiary. Sources that are normally considered to fit into one category may sometimes be used as another also. This we have discussed in the categorization part. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to list or to categorize a particular source under secondary or tertiary. If you remember, I have mentioned that Some of the thinkers, they placed reference sources under the category of tertiary sources, and some of the thinkers, they have placed reference sources under the category of secondary sources. Same is true about textbooks also. Some thinkers places textbook under the secondary sources of information and some under the category of tertiary sources of information. So, it depends upon the context as well as the contents. That is why we say content is the king, means after analyzing the content, it becomes clear whether the particular source is to be categorized under tertiary source of information or secondary source of information. So, this way tertiary sources summarizes or provide commentaries on secondary sources of information. Using tertiary sources of information is generally for gaining the overview of the topic. We use them to know about our topic, to gain an overview of our topic and to have a better understanding of our topic and to read the large amount of information which is available about primary and secondary sources of information. These secondary sources, they are just consulted for research purpose only and to finalize your research topic, but they are not useful for your analysis part, means they just tells you about the available sources. That is why they are in the form of indexes, abstracts, lists, bibliographies, directories or databases. So, they are not containing that type of information which is very depth in nature. They are just the listing or the summaries of the available sources. That is why tertiary sources of information are there to just provide the overview of the topic. In this way, I hope after this session you will be able to identify the tertiary sources of information and it becomes clear to you to how to categorize the primary, tertiary and secondary sources of information. Thank you.